They seized her infant daughter to settle a debt she never owed, dragging the child from her arms in the scorching heat of a frontier town, where law meant nothing and power meant everything. But when a Modoc Bone Trail scout rode in at high sun with dust on his boots and vengeance in his eyes, the men who thought they owned everything were about to learn that some debts can only be paid in blood. Arizona Territory, high sun, Saturday market. 1881. The heat didn't just beat down on Prospect Ridge. It pressed into the earth like a branding iron held too long against flesh, turning the packed dirt of the town square into something close to stone, cracked and pale as old bones bleached by decades of merciless sun. Wooden stalls lined the perimeter of the square, their frames warped and twisted by the relentless climate, sagging under the weight of withered vegetables that looked more like dried leather than food. Strips of jerked meat hanging like dark curtains from iron hooks, and barrels of grain that smelled faintly of rot and mouse droppings, and the kind of desperation that came from trying to sell anything to anyone just to survive another week. Flies buzzed in thick clouds around the meat stalls, their drone a constant soundtrack to the misery that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. A few chickens pecked listlessly at scattered feed near the general store. Too hot to do much more than exist, but nobody was shopping today. Not when the land office steps had been transformed into something far more sinister. A stage for cruelty dressed up as law, where human lives were weighed against ledgers and found wanting, where justice wore the mask of commerce and hid its face in shame. Emmeline Dunham stood at the base of those steps, her arms trembling but achingly empty, her calico dress soaked through with sweat and tears, the pale blue fabric now dark with moisture, clinging to her thin frame like a second skin that weighed far too much for her already burdened shoulders to bear. Her blonde hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, had come loose in wild strands that stuck to her forehead and neck, making her look like someone who had just survived a storm, which in many ways she had. Her face was pale despite the heat, drained of color except for the red rims around her eyes and the dust that caked her cheeks, where tears had cut clean tracks through the grime. Her daughter, barely 8 months old with wispy blonde curls that caught the sunlight like spun gold, and eyes the color of summer sky just before twilight, lay in a wicker basket 10 feet away, positioned on a wooden table like merchandise to be inspected and appraised. 2 men in leather vests stained dark with sweat stood guard on either side, rifles slung across their backs, their faces hard and indifferent as the desert itself, carved from the same unforgiving stone that made up the surrounding mesas. The baby cooed softly, reaching tiny fingers toward her mother, opening and closing her small fists in that universal gesture of infant need, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around her, unaware that she was the prize in a game she never asked to play. Emmeline's heart shattered with every sound her daughter made, every coo and gurgle driving another spike of anguish through her chest. "This property and all assets therein," barked the land commissioner, a rat-faced man named Silas, Vern with thinning hair slicked back with too much pomade, and a voice like rusted nails scraping across a tin roof, reading from a scroll of yellowed parchment that looked older than justice itself, the paper crackling in his thin fingers. "Are hereby seized under the Prospect Ridge Creditors Relief Act, Article 7, subsection D, ratified by the territorial governor in the year of our Lord 1879, due to the outstanding debt of Mr. Jonathan Dunham, deceased, totaling $640 in unpaid mining claims, gambling debts accumulated at the Red Canyon Saloon, merchant accounts at 3 separate establishments, and various other financial obligations, including all household goods, livestock both present and future, land parcels measuring 40 acres, mining equipment, personal effects, and the minor child, female, age estimated 8 months, to be auctioned to the highest bidder for purposes of debt satisfaction. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass before a wildfire. A mix of miners with dust-caked faces and broken fingernails. Merchants in sweat-stained waistcoats with account books tucked under their arms. Ranch hands who had ridden in for supplies. And women clutching their shawls tight despite the oppressive heat. Their eyes wide with horror and morbid fascination. Unable to look away from the spectacle, some looked away in shame. Their faces twisted with the knowledge that they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong. Others leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. Feeding on tragedy the way vultures fed on carrion. A few whispered prayers under their breath. Rosary beads clicking softly, most simply stared. Frozen by the terrible momentum of institutional cruelty. Emmeline lunged forward with a desperate cry that tore from somewhere deep in her chest. Her voice breaking like glass thrown against stone. She is not property. She is my child. My daughter, my blood. You cannot do this. This is madness. This is evil. This is against God and nature. Two deputies materialized from the crowd like sharks sensing blood in the water. Grabbing her by the arms with brutal efficiency. Their grips like iron shackles designed to break spirits before they broke bones. Fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. She fought them with everything she had, twisting and thrashing. Her boots scraping against the packed earth. Leaving drag marks in the dust as they hauled her backward. Away from her daughter, away from everything that mattered. "Let me go," she screamed. Her voice going hoarse. "You have no right." "No right. She is mine. She's all I have, please." "Restrain her," Vern snapped without looking up from his document. His voice flat and bureaucratic, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than destroying a woman's life. "And let the proceedings continue without further disruption from hysterical parties who refuse to accept the lawful execution of territorial statutes. She's not a thing to be sold like cattle or furniture or tools." Emmeline screamed, her voice raw and ragged. Tears streaming down her face and cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Mixing with sweat and desperation, "Please, please, I am begging you. I will work every day until I drop. I will pay every cent. Just do not take her from me. She is all I have left in this world. She is all that remains of anything good." Her pleas fell on ears that had long ago stopped hearing human suffering. Ears that had been trained to hear only the rustle of paper currency and the clink of coins. The auctioneer. A portly man named Dutch Calloway, with a silver watch chain stretched across his considerable belly and a face red from too much whiskey and too little conscience, stepped forward with the practiced showmanship of someone who had sold everything, from horses to houses to human dignity. He raised a wooden gavel worn smooth from years of turning lives into transactions, its surface polished by the sweat of countless palms. His voice boomed across the square like a carnival barker announcing the main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the final asset in the Dunham estate liquidation. One healthy female infant, approximately 8 months of age. Good bloodlines from respectable pioneer stock. Suitable for domestic service training or adoption into respectable households, seeking to expand their families. Opening bid is set at $200. Hands shot up immediately. Greedy fingers reaching toward a future they had no right to touch, no moral authority to claim. Old ranchers with sun-scorched faces and cold calculation in their eyes. Men who saw cheap labor for their expanding homesteads. Who could raise the girl to work their kitchens and tend their livestock without wages. A shopkeeper's wife in black silk that was far too fine for Prospect Ridge. Her sharp features twisted in a smile like a viper preparing to strike. Already imagining the girl scrubbing her floors and washing her laundry in 10 years. A servant who could never leave, never complain, never expect payment. A gambler with gold teeth that flashed when he grinned. His cards tucked into his vest pocket, his mind already calculating profits. Knowing he could transport the child to California and sell her again to a mining camp or a San Francisco brothel for triple the price. A cattle baron from the Northern Territory who collected children the way other men collected art, adding them to his ranch like livestock, working them until they were old enough to either marry off or discard. Emmeline felt her soul being torn apart, piece by piece, watching the hands rise, watching people bid on her daughter like she was a prized mare or a piece of land. 220, called the rancher. 250, countered the shopkeeper's wife. 275, added the gambler with a wink. Each bid drove another nail into Emmeline's heart. Then came the voice that silenced them all. Smooth and cultured and dripping with menace like honey laced with arsenic. 300. Every head turned in unison toward the man leaning against the hitching post near the Red Canyon Saloon. A figure dressed in fine black wool, tailored in San Francisco, despite the murderous heat. His vest embroidered with silver thread. His hat tilted just enough to shadow his face while still allowing his cold blue eyes to survey the crowd with the proprietary gaze of a man who owned most of what he saw. A gold ring glinted on his finger, set with a ruby the size of a thumbnail. As he tapped ash from a thin cigar imported from Cuba, Emmeline's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her breath catching in her throat, Luther Grimes. The name alone carried weight in Prospect Ridge, spoken in whispers. Accompanied by crossed fingers and prayers for protection, the richest man in the territory. Owner of the largest silver mine that employed half the town and killed a dozen men a year in cave-ins and accidents. 3 gambling halls where fortunes died nightly and men lost everything, including their dignity. 2 brothels where souls were traded for coin and women disappeared when they became inconvenient. He owned the bank, controlled the water rights, held mortgages on half the buildings in town, and had the territorial governor in his pocket through generous campaign contributions. He was a man who collected people the way other men collected cattle, branding them with obligation through debt, fear, or both, working them until they broke and then discarding them without a second thought. His empire was built on the backs of broken families and shattered dreams. "She have a proper upbringing," Grimes said smoothly, his voice like honey poured over rot. Each word carefully chosen to sound benevolent while meaning precisely the opposite. Better than anything a beggar's widow living in a shack could provide. "I assure you, good people, the child will want for nothing under my care. She will have food, shelter, education, all the advantages that her unfortunate circumstances have denied her." The crowd knew what that meant. Another soul added to Grimes's collection, another life bent to serve his empire. Another child who would grow up in his household until she was old enough to work his businesses, or warm his bed, or both. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. Fear kept mouths shut tighter than any lock. Emmeline's knees buckled beneath her, her legs giving out entirely. But the deputies held her upright with cruel efficiency, forcing her to watch as Grimes stepped forward with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, never faced consequences for the devastation he left in his wake. The gavel hovered in the air, poised to fall like an executioner's blade. Dutch Calloway's mouth opened to declare the sale final. Emmeline opened her mouth to scream one final time, to curse them all, to call down heaven's judgment on this mockery of justice. And then they heard it, the sound of hooves, slow and deliberate, striking the packed earth with a rhythm that felt less like arrival and more like reckoning. Each step measured and purposeful as a heartbeat counting down to violence. Steady as a war drum calling warriors to battle. A hush fell over the square, thick and suffocating as smoke from a grass fire, as every eye turned toward the eastern trail where the desert met the town, where the wilderness pressed against civilization's fragile borders, out of the shimmering heat haze, distorted by waves of rising warmth that made the air itself seem to ripple and bend like water. Creating mirages that danced at the edges of vision, rode a man on a paint horse. The horse's coat was marked with streaks of white and rust like war paint, carefully applied by patient hands according to ancient tradition. Its eyes dark and knowing, ancient somehow, as if it had carried its rider through countless battles and bore the weight of those memories in its steady gait. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame suggesting strength built through years of survival rather than leisure, his skin the color of sun-baked clay, weathered by wind and hardship and exposure into something that looked carved by the elements rather than born. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, a single eagle feather woven into the binding, the quill wrapped with red thread in the traditional Modoc way, the feather itself showing signs of age and care, clearly carried for years as something precious. He wore buckskin pants stained dark with travel and marked with patches where thorns had torn and been mended, a vest made from wolf pelt with the fur turned inward for warmth in cold mountain nights. And across his chest hung a necklace of small bones, each one carved with symbols that told stories older than the town itself, older than the territory, older than the nation that claimed dominion over these lands. The bones clicked softly together with the horse's movement, creating a rhythm like whispered prayers. A bone trail scout, Modoc. The crowd recognized what he was immediately, and fear rippled through them like electricity through a lightning rod. Bone trail scouts were legends whispered around campfires when men wanted to frighten children or remind each other that the wilderness still held mysteries that civilization could not explain away. They were men who could track a ghost across solid rock, who could read the language of death written in scattered remains left by animals or men, who walked between the world of the living and the realm of spirits with equal comfort, who spoke to the dead and heard their answers. They were trackers, hunters, guides through territories where white men died of thirst within sight of water. They were not men to be trifled with. They were not men who could be bought, threatened, or controlled. He dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of decades spent in the saddle, probably more time on horseback than on foot, his boots hitting the ground without sound despite their weight, moving with the practiced silence of a predator stalking prey. Every movement was economical, purposeful, containing no wasted energy. He reached into his saddlebag with deliberate care, his movements unhurried and methodical, and pulled out a leather pouch heavy enough to make the horse shift slightly under the change in weight. The pouch was old, worn smooth by handling, stained dark in places, without a word, without acknowledging anyone in the crowd, without even glancing at the people staring at him with mixtures of fear and fascination. He walked forward with the steady confidence of a man who had already decided how this would end and saw no reason to doubt that outcome. His boots left clear prints in the dust, each step placed with precision. He climbed to land off his steps slowly, taking them one at a time. Then he dropped the pouch at Silas Verne's feet. The impact was solid, final, like a judge's gavel. The pouch split open slightly from the force, spilling gold dust in small nuggets across the weathered wood, glittering like a promise or a threat, catching the brutal sunlight and throwing it back in sharp, defiant flashes that made several people squint. No one moved, no one breathed. No one dared break the silence that had fallen like a shroud over the entire square. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Emmeline stared at the man, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack under the pressure. Her mind spinning frantically, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand who this stranger was and why he would do this. She knew those eyes, even from this distance, even shadowed by the brim of his weathered hat. She knew them, dark and haunted, carrying weight that no man should have to bear, depths that spoke of losses that could never be recovered. But where had she seen them before? Grimes stepped forward, his carefully maintained composure cracking just slightly, his face darkening like a storm rolling in over distant mountains, bringing thunder and destruction in its wake. "Who the hell are you to interrupt legal proceedings authorized by territorial law?" The scout said nothing. But his gaze shifted to Grimes, cold and unwavering. The kind of look that didn't need words to communicate danger. The kind of look that made smaller men reconsider their choices and back away slowly. It was the look of a man who had killed before and would kill again if circumstances required it. Grimes was not a smaller man, had built his empire on intimidation and violence. But even he hesitated under that gaze. "Do you wish to challenge the bid?" Vern asked, his voice uncertain now, trembling at the edges like a leaf before a storm. His bureaucratic confidence evaporating in the face of something he couldn't categorize or control. Because proper procedures must be followed, the scout reached into his vest with the same deliberate care and pulled out a second pouch. This one heavier than the first, bulging with weight that suggested significant wealth. He dropped it beside the other with the same measured precision. Gold coins spilled out this time, mixing with the dust, clinking against the wood with sounds like bells tolling for the dead. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds of dollars worth. The crowd gasped collectively. 600, Vern whispered, his eyes going wide as saucers as he stared at the fortune laid before him. More money than he made in 3 years as land commissioner. That's double the original offer. That's more than the entire debt including interest and fees. The crowd erupted in whispers. Speculation running wild through the assembled townsfolk like fire through dry brush. Everyone talking at once, theories flying. Who was he? Where did he get that much gold? What was his connection to the widow? Was he the real father? Had they been lovers? The rumors would feed gossip for months. Grimes's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His hand drifting toward the ornate revolver at his hip with its pearl handle and silver inlay, custom made in a Denver gunsmith's shop. Worth more than most men's horses. You got no authority here, savage. This is a civilized auction conducted under territorial law. You can't just ride in here from whatever rock you crawled out from under, and... The scout's hand moved to the hilt of a long knife strapped to his thigh, his thumb resting on the carved bone handle. And the movement was so smooth, so practiced, so utterly without hesitation, that it communicated more than any words ever could. It said that he had used that knife before. It said that he would use it again. It said that Grimes's gun would clear leather about half a second after the knife opened his throat. Grimes froze mid-sentence, his hand stopping halfway to his weapon. Self-preservation finally overcame pride. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed across the square. "Sold," Vern declared, his voice cracking with uncertainty and fear and relief that this terrifying confrontation was ending without bloodshed. To the Modoc scout for $600 in gold. Payment received in full, debt satisfied, transaction complete. All legal obligations hereby fulfilled. Whispers erupted through the crowd like wildfire jumping from tree to tree during the dry season, spreading faster than anyone could contain. Rumors already taking shape and growing in the telling. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why would he pay so much? What was his connection to the widow? What would Grimes do about this insult? Would there be violence? Should they leave before it started? Emmeline collapsed to her knees as the deputies released her in shock, their grip loosening as they tried to process what had just happened. And she crawled forward across the dust-packed ground, her dress dragging through the dirt, her hands shaking as she reached for the basket with desperate need. She lifted her daughter into her arms, clutching the infant to her chest with fierce protectiveness, pressing her face against the baby's soft hair that smelled of milk and innocence, sobbing so hard her entire body shook and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but hold on and thank God and every saint she could remember. "Thank you," she gasped, looking up at the man through vision blurred by tears and dust and overwhelming relief. "Thank you, thank you. I don't understand, but thank you. God bless you. Whoever you are." But he didn't answer. He only looked at her once, his dark eyes unreadable. carrying depths she couldn't begin to fathom. Oceans of pain and loss that she could only glimpse the surface of. And then turned back toward his horse without waiting for further acknowledgement or gratitude. Grimes stepped into his path, blocking him with the arrogance of a man who still believed his wealth made him untouchable. His voice low and venomous as a rattlesnake's hiss. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, savage. Nobody crosses Luther Grimes and lives to tell about it. I will see you dead before the week is out. I will hunt you down personally." The scout stopped, turned his head slightly, and spoke for the first time. His voice deep and rough as stone grinding against stone, carrying an accent that marked him as someone who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it with deliberate precision, choosing each word with care. "I have made worse mistakes and survived them all." Then he walked past Grimes as if the man were nothing but shadow, insubstantial and temporary, beneath notice, not worth the effort of acknowledgement. Grimes's face went purple with rage, his hands clenching into fists. But he didn't move, didn't draw his weapon, didn't follow through on his threat. Something in the scout's eyes had warned him that any violence would be returned tenfold. That this was not a man who could be intimidated or killed easily. Emmeline held her daughter close, her mind reeling, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to place the man who had saved her, trying to reconcile the stranger with something nagging at the edges of her memory, and then it hit her like physical force. Like being struck in the chest, the scar. A jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw. Barely visible beneath the sun-darkened skin, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The kind of scar that came from a blade or broken bone tearing through flesh. She had seen that scar before, 7 years ago, in the middle of a blizzard that had tried to kill them both. When she had been running from her stepfather's violence and found work at a remote trading post. When she had pulled a dying man from a frozen riverbank where claim jumpers had left him to die. When she had dragged him into an abandoned trapper's cabin and nursed him back from the edge of death with nothing but fire. Thin broth made from pine nuts and dried meat. And the stubborn refusal to let another person die if she could prevent it. He had left without a word when the snow melted and the trails opened again in early spring. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone like smoke on the wind. She had thought about him sometimes over the years, wondered if he had survived, wondered if she had imagined the gratitude in his eyes during lucid moments. And now, 7 years later, he had returned, not to repay a debt, because what he had just done exceeded any possible repayment, but to stop one, to prevent her from losing what he had lost, to save a child the way his own had not been saved. She understood now this wasn't about her. This was about a wound that had never healed. 7 years earlier, winter of 1874. Northern Arizona Territory snow was rare in the Arizona highlands, but when it came, it descended with a fury that seemed to hold personal grudges against every living thing, turning the world into a white grave where silence became so absolute it pressed against the eardrums like water at depth. The temperature plummeted so fast that sap froze inside standing trees and split their trunks, with sounds like rifle shots echoing through the canyons. Emmeline was 17 then, barely more than a child herself, but already carrying the weight of survival that aged people faster than years ever could. She had been running from a stepfather named Cyrus Webb, whose fists spoke louder than his words, and whose belt left marks that took weeks to fade from her back and arms. Her mother had died the previous autumn from consumption, coughing blood into rags until there was nothing left inside her but empty space and apologies, with her mother gone. There was no buffer between Emmeline and Cyrus's drunken rages that came every time he lost money at cards or simply because the day ended in darkness. So she ran. She packed what little she owned into a canvas sack, stole $3 from the coffee tin where Cyrus hid his drinking money, and disappeared into the high country before dawn while he slept off his latest bottle. She found work at McKinnon's trading post, a ramshackle collection of buildings clinging to the side of a mountain like a desperate prayer, serving trappers and prospectors who came through looking for supplies and sometimes company. Old Malcolm McKinnon was gruff but fair, asked no questions about her bruises or why a girl so young was traveling alone. Just put her to work cleaning, cooking, mending clothes for the rough men who passed through like ghosts. She earned her keep and a corner of the storage room to sleep in, plus whatever food was left at the end of the day. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and nobody hit her, which made it paradise compared to what she had left behind. The trading post sat at the junction of 3 trails, each one leading deeper into territories where white men were tolerated only if they minded their business and respected the land. Modoc territory to the north, Shoshone hunting grounds to the east, and disputed mining claims to the west where violence erupted as regularly as thunderstorms. McKinnon had taught her the basics of survival in this harsh landscape: how to read weather and the color of the sky at dawn, how to find water by watching where birds flew in the evening, how to tell the difference between a wolf track and a dog track by the spacing of the claws, how to make her steps quiet when walking through snow so predators wouldn't hear her coming. She learned quickly because failure meant death.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
And death came easy in the high country during winter. It was during one of her supply runs, checking the trapline that McKinnon maintained for winter meat, that she found him. She had been following the creek eastward, dragging a wooden sled that McKinnon had built for hauling. Checking each trap location marked by blazes cut into tree bark. The snow was knee-deep in places, thigh-deep in others where drifts had formed against rocks and fallen logs. Her breath came in clouds that froze on her scarf, creating a mask of ice around her mouth and nose. Her fingers ached inside her mittens despite the wool lining McKinnon's late wife had sewn years ago. The cold was the kind that made bones hurt, that made thinking slow and movements clumsy, that whispered lies about how nice it would be to just sit down and rest for a moment. She had learned to ignore those whispers. The creek ran between high banks carved by spring floods, the water now frozen solid except where it flowed fast over rocks, creating patches of black ice treacherous as sin. That was where she saw the dark shape against the white. At first she thought it was a deer that had broken through ice and drowned, or maybe a bear that had emerged too early from hibernation and succumbed to the cold. But as she got closer, her heart seized in her chest. It was a man. He lay half submerged in the frozen creek where the ice had given way, his body twisted at an unnatural angle that suggested he had fallen from somewhere high, blood staining the white snow and clear ice beneath him in dark, spreading pools that looked black in the failing afternoon light. His skin had taken on the gray-blue color of death, his lips purple, frost forming in his hair and beard. A Modoc scout based on his clothing and the bone necklace partially visible beneath his torn shirt. He had been shot. She could see the hole in his side, just above his hip, still seeping blood slowly, which meant his heart was still beating, still trying to keep him alive despite the impossible odds. His leg was bent wrong, clearly broken, probably from whatever fall had landed him in the creek. Bruises covered his face in shades of purple and yellow, and his knuckles were split and bloody. Evidence of a fight before the shooting. Claim jumpers most likely. Or rival trappers who didn't want competition. Or just men who killed because they could, and the wilderness kept secrets better than any grave. Emmeline dropped everything she was carrying. Her mind raced through calculations. He was too heavy for her to lift. The trading post was 3 miles back through deep snow. Moving him might kill him if he had internal injuries. Leaving him would definitely kill him within the hour as the temperature continued to drop. The nearest shelter was an abandoned trapper's cabin she had discovered 2 weeks earlier, maybe half a mile downstream, built against a rock face that provided some protection from wind. Half a mile, she could do half a mile. She had to. Emmeline waded into the creek without hesitation, gasping as ice water flooded her boots and soaked her skirts, the cold so intense it felt like burning. Like her legs were being consumed by invisible fire, she grabbed him under the arms, bracing her feet against rocks beneath the water, and pulled with everything she had. He didn't budge. She tried again, leaning back. Using her whole body weight, this time he moved slightly, sliding a few inches across the ice. She pulled again, grunting with effort, her muscles screaming, her hands already going numb, inch by inch. She dragged him from the water onto the snowy bank, leaving a trail of blood and water behind them. Once she had him on solid ground, she ran back to her sled, grabbed the rope, and tied it around his chest under his arms, with knots McKinnon had taught her. Then she began the hardest work of her young life, dragging a grown man who probably weighed twice what she did through knee-deep snow, while her own body was already exhausted and frozen. She pulled the rope over her shoulder and leaned forward, taking one step, then another, the sled runners cutting through snow with resistance that felt impossible. She fell twice in the first 100 yards, face planting into snow that filled her mouth and nose. Each time she got back up, grabbed the rope, and kept pulling. The man made no sound, gave no indication he was alive except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The sun was setting, turning the snow orange and pink. Beautiful and deadly, she pulled harder, ignoring the burning in her shoulders and back, ignoring the way her legs trembled with each step. The cabin appeared like salvation, a dark square against white, its door hanging partially open from when the last occupant had abandoned it. She dragged him up the 2 steps to the threshold, then across the rough wooden floor to the far wall where a stone fireplace stood cold and empty. Her hands shook so violently she could barely strike the flint McKinnon had given her. But eventually sparks caught in the dried moss and bark shavings she kept in a tin, and flame flickered to life. She fed the fire carefully, adding small sticks first, then larger pieces from the woodpile the previous occupant had left stacked against the wall. Warmth began to fill the small space, pushing back the killing cold. Then she turned her attention to the man. His clothes were frozen to his body, the leather and fabric stiff as boards. She cut them away with her knife, revealing the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had entered his side and exited through his back, missing vital organs by what looked like inches, but still causing massive trauma and blood loss. His left leg was definitely broken, the bone protruding slightly through torn skin. Bruises covered his torso in patterns that suggested he had been beaten with rifle butts or clubs before being shot and left for dead. Emmeline had helped McKinnon tend injured trappers before, had learned basic field medicine because doctors were weeks away and most injuries couldn't wait. She heated water in a pot over the fire, using snow from outside. She had limited supplies in her pack. A small bottle of whiskey McKinnon insisted all his people carry for emergencies, clean rags torn from an old shirt, a sewing kit with strong thread, a tin of salve made from pine resin and animal fat. She worked through the night. First she cleaned the bullet wound with whiskey, pouring it directly into the hole and watching his body convulse even though he remained unconscious. Then she packed it with clean cloth soaked in hot water and the pine resin salve, hoping to prevent infection. The leg required more work. She had to set the bone, pulling it back into alignment while bracing her foot against his hip for leverage. Even unconscious, he groaned with pain that cut through whatever darkness held him. She splinted the leg using branches she broke to length and tied with strips torn from her own petticoat. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking outside, gray light filtering through gaps in the cabin walls. She collapsed beside him, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. For 3 days, she maintained her vigil. She kept the fire going constantly, feeding it wood she gathered from the surrounding forest during brief trips outside. She boiled pine needles to make tea that had some nutritional value, forcing spoonfuls between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She made thin broth from the dried meat in her pack, adding snow and herbs she recognized from McKinnon's teachings. The fever came on the second day, turning his skin hot as coals, making him thrash and mutter in languages he didn't understand. He spoke Modoc words that sounded like prayers or curses. He called names she couldn't make out. He fought invisible enemies, his arms swinging at shadows only he could see. She held him down when the convulsions got bad, using her whole body weight to keep him from tearing open his wounds. She bathed his forehead with cool water, changed the bandages when they soaked through with blood and fluid. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, asking for this stranger's life to be spared. On the fourth morning, she woke to find him watching her. His eyes were clear for the first time, dark and intelligent and full of pain but aware, present, seeing her as a person rather than a fever dream. "Water," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, rough as gravel. She brought him water in a tin cup, supporting his head while he drank. "You saved me," he said, the words coming slowly, his English accented but clear. "You were dying," she replied simply. "Most would have let me," he said. "I'm not most people," she answered. He studied her face for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emmeline," she said. "Emmeline Webb. I am Pakwa," he said, "of the Modoc people, of the Stonethorn clan." "Who did this to you?" she asked. His face darkened. "Men who wanted what was not theirs to take." He didn't elaborate. And she didn't push. She fed him more broth, checked his wounds, adjusted his splint. He watched her work with quiet intensity, studying her movements, her face, as if memorizing every detail. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why what?" she replied. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about her answer. "Because someone should have done the same for my mother," she said finally, her voice catching slightly, "and no one did." He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Over the next week, she continued to care for him as his strength slowly returned. They spoke little but communicated much in the silence. She learned he had been tracking claim jumpers who had killed 3 Modoc hunters. Following them for weeks through the high country, he had found them, confronted them, and been ambushed by reinforcements he hadn't known were there. They had beaten him, shot him, and left him in the creek to freeze. Thinking the job was done, they were wrong. He learned she was running from violence, seeking safety in solitude, building a new life from nothing. He saw the old bruises on her arms, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the hardness in her eyes that didn't match her young face. He understood what that meant. By the end of the second week, he could stand with support, could take a few steps before pain forced him back down. The snow began to melt as temperatures rose slightly, creating the first signs that spring would eventually come. On the morning she woke to find the door open and his bedroll empty. She wasn't entirely surprised. His tracks led east, toward Modoc territory, steady despite the limp that would probably never fully heal. He had left his bone necklace hanging on a peg by the door. A gift, or perhaps a promise. She took it down and held it, feeling the weight of carved bones that told stories she couldn't read. She never expected to see him again, but she never forgot his eyes, and now 7 years later, those same eyes had looked at her across a town square. He had remembered too, and he had come back. Present day, Prospect Ridge. Night Emmeline sat in the small room she rented above the seamstress shop, holding her daughter close, the bone necklace now around her own neck where she had worn it for 7 years like a talisman. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of how close she had come to being lost forever. A soft knock came at the door. Emmeline's heart raced, but she recognized the pattern. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The same pattern Pakwa had used when checking if she was awake in the cabin all those years ago. She opened the door, slowly. And there he stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands. His face carved by time and suffering into something harder than she remembered, but still recognizable. "We need to talk," he said quietly. She stepped aside, letting him enter. He moved carefully, his eyes scanning the room, noting the window, the door, the furniture placement, calculating exits and threats with the automatic awareness of someone who had survived by always being prepared. "You can't stay here," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Grimes will come for you before sunrise. He does not accept defeat. He will send men to take the child by force and burn this building if necessary." "Then what do I do?" Emmeline asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to sound calm. "You come with me," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "Tonight now. We leave before they organize." "Where?" she asked. "North, into the high country. To places where Grimes's money means nothing and his men fear to follow," he replied. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, then back at Pakwa. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Needing to understand, "You paid a fortune for her freedom. You could have just ridden away." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion barely contained. "Because 7 years ago you saved my life when you had every reason to leave me in that creek. Because you asked nothing in return. Because you saw me as human when most see only savage, and because—" He paused, his hands gripping his hat so hard the leather creaked. "Because I had a daughter once," he said finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "and she was taken from me. Stolen by men who believed they had the right. And I was too broken to stop them, too late to save her. And I have searched for 7 years and found nothing but graves and dead ends." Emmeline's breath caught in her throat. "I cannot bring my daughter back," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with devastating honesty. "But I can stop it from happening to someone else. I can make sure your daughter stays with her mother the way mine should have stayed with hers." Understanding flooded through Emmeline like cold water. This wasn't about repaying a debt. This was about redemption for a failure that haunted him. This was about saving the child he couldn't save 7 years ago. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on his arm. "I'll come with you," she said softly, "and we'll keep her safe together." He nodded once, something flickering in his eyes that might have been gratitude or relief or both. "Pack only what you can carry," he said, his voice returning to practical urgency. "We leave in 10 minutes. The moon is down. The streets are empty." "We have a small window." Emmeline moved quickly, wrapping her daughter in warm blankets, gathering what little she owned into a small bag. A change of clothes, the few dollars she had saved, a photograph of her mother, the bone necklace she wore. Nothing else mattered. Pakwa checked the hallway, then gestured for her to follow. They moved through the darkness like spirits, making no sound, leaving no trace. His horse waited in the alley behind the building. Patient and steady, he lifted Emmeline and the baby onto the saddle, then mounted behind them, his arms creating a protective circle. They rode slowly at first, keeping to shadows, avoiding the main streets where Grimes's men patrolled. Once they cleared the town limits, Pakwa urged the horse faster. They galloped into the night, leaving Prospect Ridge behind them. Lights began appearing in windows as Grimes's men started their search. But by then, the 3 of them were already ghosts, disappeared into darkness, heading toward high country where different rules applied, where survival mattered more than money, where a Modoc scout knew every trail and every hiding place, where they would be safe, at least for now. They rode through the darkness for hours, the horses breathing steady and rhythmic beneath them, its hooves finding purchase on trails that seemed invisible to Emmeline's untrained eyes. But which? Pakwa navigated with the certainty of someone reading a familiar book. The baby slept against Emmeline's chest, wrapped so tightly in blankets that only her small face showed, her breath creating tiny clouds in the cold night air that smelled of sage and distant rain. Emmeline had never been this far from Prospect Ridge, had spent her entire life in territories mapped and named by men who claimed ownership through violence and paperwork. But now they were entering something older, something that existed before borders and belonged to no one because it belonged to everyone who knew how to listen to it. The landscape shifted around them as they climbed higher, the desert scrub giving way to juniper and pinyon, then to ponderosa pine that towered like cathedral pillars against the star-scattered sky. Pakwa said nothing as they rode, his attention focused entirely on their surroundings, reading signs that Emmeline couldn't see but could feel in the tension of his body. The way his head turned slightly at sounds she didn't hear. The way his hand occasionally moved to rest on the knife at his thigh. They were being followed, she knew without him having to say it. Knew from the way he urged the horse faster through certain stretches. The way he chose paths that crossed streams where their tracks would be washed away. The way he doubled back twice to confuse pursuit. Dawn was breaking cold and gray when they finally stopped at the edge of a canyon that dropped away. So suddenly, it made Emmeline's stomach lurch. The canyon was perhaps 200 feet across, its walls sheer rock carved by millennia of water that now flowed as a thin silver thread far below, catching the first light like a blade. Spanning the gap was a bridge that made Emmeline's heart stop. It was ancient, constructed from rope and wooden planks that had weathered to gray, swaying gently in the wind that rose from the canyon depths, each movement causing the whole structure to shift and creak like a living thing in pain. The ropes were thick as a man's wrist but frayed in places, showing the pale interior fibers where the outer layers had worn away from years of weather and use. Some of the planks were missing entirely, leaving gaps that showed straight through to the deadly drop below. Others looked rotten, their edges crumbling, dark with moisture and decay. "We have to cross that," Emmeline whispered. Not really a question because she already knew the answer. "It's the only way," Pakwa replied, dismounting and helping her down with careful hands. Taking the baby from her arms. "Grimes's men won't follow us across. They're too afraid of heights and they don't know the bridge's secrets." "What secrets?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "Which planks will hold and which won't," he said simply. "Which ropes are still strong and which are ready to snap, where to step and where not to step. Knowledge passed down through generations of my people who built this bridge and maintained it long before white men came to this territory." He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "You must trust me completely. Step exactly where I step. Hold the ropes exactly where I hold them. Do not look down. Do not freeze. Do not panic. Can you do this?" Emmeline looked at the bridge, at the impossible distance it spanned, at the wind making it dance, at the drop that would kill anyone who fell. Then she looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in Pakwa's arms, innocent and trusting. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the terror crawling up her spine. "I can do this." Pakwa nodded once, respect flickering across his face. He handed her the baby, then began unloading supplies from his horse, creating 2 packs that could be carried across, leaving behind anything not essential. The horse he led to a grove of trees 100 yards from the bridge, where grass grew thick and a spring provided water. "She knows to wait," he said when he returned. "She'll stay here until I come back for her. Horses are smarter than men give them credit for." He fashioned a sling from a blanket, showing Emmeline how to secure the baby against her chest with both hands free. "You'll need your hands for the ropes," he explained, testing the knots with practiced efficiency. "The baby is safer tied to you than carried. If you slip, your instinct will be to catch yourself, not to hold on to her." The practicality of it made sense. But it also meant that if Emmeline fell, her daughter fell with her. The weight of that responsibility pressed down like physical force. Pakwa shouldered one pack, kept the other in his hand, and approached the bridge. "Stay 3 steps behind me," he instructed. "Watch where I place my feet. Mirror my movements exactly. If I stop, you stop. If I tell you to freeze, you become stone. Understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He stepped onto the first plank. The entire bridge swayed, the movement traveling along its length like a wave, causing every rope to groan and every board to creak. Emmeline's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Pakwa moved forward steadily, stepping over one plank entirely, placing his foot near the edge of another where it met the rope, testing his weight before committing fully. She followed, stepping exactly where he had stepped, ripping the rope railing so hard her knuckles went white. The wind picked up as they moved further from the edge, pushing against them with invisible hands, making the bridge sway harder. Below them, the canyon yawned like a hungry mouth. "Don't look down," she told herself, but her eyes betrayed her, glancing through the gaps between planks to see rocks and water impossibly far below. Vertigo washed over her, making the world tilt. "Eyes on me," Pakwa called back, his voice cutting through her panic. "Only on me, nothing else exists." Just the next step, she forced her gaze up, focusing on his back, on the eagle feather in his hair, on the rhythm of his movements. Step, pause, test, step, pause, test, step. They were halfway across when she heard it. Voices behind them, distant but growing closer. Men shouting to each other, the sound of horses being pushed hard. "Keep moving," Pakwa said, his voice still calm but with an edge of urgency. "Don't look back, don't speed up, maintain the same pace." But the voices were getting louder. And now she could make out words. "There, at the bridge. I see them. They're crossing. We can catch them. Spread out. Don't let them escape." Emmeline's foot slipped slightly on a wet plank, and she gasped, catching herself. The baby stirred against her chest, making small sounds of distress, sensing her mother's fear. "Breathe," Pakwa commanded. "Slow and steady, you're doing well. We're almost there." They were 3/4 across when the first of Grimes's men reached the canyon edge. She recognized him even at this distance. A brutal enforcer named Cutter Walsh, who was known for breaking fingers when collecting debts. He was accompanied by 5 others, all armed, all mounted, all looking at the bridge with calculation. "That bridge won't hold all of us," one of them said, his voice carrying across the canyon. "Don't need to," Walsh replied, pulling a rifle from his saddle. "Just need to spook them, make them rush, make them fall." He raised the rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the morning air like thunder. The bullet didn't hit them, wasn't meant to. But it struck one of the rope supports near the middle of the bridge. The rope vibrated like a plucked string, and the entire structure shuddered. "Don't stop," Pakwa said, his voice tight now. "Keep moving. We're close." Another shot, this one closer. The bullet punched through a plank 5 feet ahead of them, sending splinters flying. The baby started crying, her wails high and terrified. Emmeline wanted to stop, wanted to comfort her, wanted to curl around her daughter and protect her from everything. But she forced herself to keep moving. Walsh fired again, and this time Emmeline felt the bullet pass close enough to hear its whisper. "Almost there," Pakwa said, and she could hear the strain in his voice, the effort of remaining calm when everything was falling apart. They were 10 feet from the far side when Walsh made his mistake. Frustrated by their steady progress, angry that his shots weren't having the desired effect, he stepped onto the bridge himself. The added weight combined with the damage from his bullets created a cascade of failure. One of the main support ropes snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The bridge lurched violently to one side. Emmeline screamed, her feet leaving the planks entirely for a moment as she swung out over empty space. Held only by her death grip on the remaining rope, Pakwa moved with impossible speed. Dropping his pack, lunging back toward her. His hand closing around her wrist like iron. "I've got you," he said. His voice steady despite the chaos. "Climb, use your feet." "Find the rope," she kicked wildly, her boots finally finding purchase on the twisted hemp. He pulled, using his entire body weight as counterbalance. And she swung back onto what remained of the bridge. Behind them, Walsh was trying to retreat, but his men were blocking the way. Their horses spooked by the gunfire and the swaying bridge.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Get off," one of them yelled. But it was too late. Another rope snapped, then another. The bridge began to come apart, sections dropping away. Planks tumbling into the void. "Go now," Pakwa shouted. And they ran the last few steps, leaping from disintegrating wood onto solid ground just as the entire center section of the bridge collapsed. Walsh managed to jump back to his side, landing hard, his rifle clattering away into the rocks. The bridge hung in tatters, useless, impassable. Emmeline collapsed on the ground, holding her daughter close. Sobbing with relief and terror, Pakwa stood at the edge, breathing hard. Looking across at Walsh and his men. "You're dead," Walsh screamed across the gap. His face purple with rage. "You hear me, you're both dead. Grimes will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Pakwa said nothing. But he pulled his knife and began cutting the remaining ropes on their side, severing the bridge's last connections. The damaged structure fell away completely, crashing down the canyon wall in a cascade of wood and rope that seemed to fall forever before finally hitting the rocks below with distant thunder. "Why did you do that?" Emmeline asked, her voice shaking. "What if we need to come back this way?" "We won't," he said simply. "And now they can't follow. They'll have to ride 3 days around the canyon to reach this side. And by then we'll be long gone." Walsh fired his pistol across the gap. But they were well out of range, and the bullets fell harmlessly into the canyon. Pakwa watched him for a moment longer, then turned away, dismissing the threat. He helped Emmeline to her feet, checked her for injuries, examined the baby who had stopped crying and was now looking around with wide, curious eyes. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than many warriors I've known. You didn't panic, you didn't freeze. You trusted me." "I didn't have much choice," she replied, trying to smile but finding her face wouldn't quite cooperate. "There's always a choice," he said. "You chose to trust." "That's not nothing." He retrieved his pack from where he'd dropped it, shouldered it again, and began walking. The terrain on this side of the canyon was different, wilder, less touched by human presence. Ancient pines grew at angles that seemed impossible, their roots gripping bare rock. Moss covered everything in shades of green, so deep they looked black in shadow. The air itself tasted different, cleaner, carrying scents of things Emmeline had no names for. They walked for another hour in silence, climbing steadily higher, following paths that weren't really paths, just slightly easier routes through impossible country. Emmeline's legs burned with effort, her arms ached from carrying the baby. But she didn't complain. Behind them, across the now unbridgeable canyon, Walsh and his men were distant specks, already turning their horses to find another route. They wouldn't give up, Emmeline knew. Men like that never did. But they had bought time, days maybe, enough to reach wherever Pakwa was taking them. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning cold. And Emmeline realized with surprise that she was still alive, that her daughter was still with her, that the impossible had become merely difficult. Pakwa led them to a small clearing where a spring bubbled up between rocks, forming a pool clear as glass. "We rest here," he said. "Drink, eat, gather strength. We have a long way to go yet." Emmeline lowered herself onto a flat rock, every muscle protesting. She unwrapped the baby, who had somehow slept through most of the terror, and let her drink. Pakwa built a small fire. So small it produced almost no smoke and heated water. He added dried herbs from a pouch, creating a tea that smelled like forests and tasted bitter but good. "Where are we going?" Emmeline asked finally. The question she'd been holding since they left Prospect Ridge. "North," he said, "to the winter camp of my people. They move with the seasons, but I know where they'll be now. Another 3 days of travel through high passes. Will they accept us?" she asked. A white woman and her child. He was quiet for a moment. Staring into his tea, "My mother was Modoc," he said finally. "My father was Shoshone. I was born between two peoples and never fully belonged to either. So I learned to make my own belonging, to find family in those who chose to stand beside me rather than those who shared my blood." He looked up at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "My people will accept you because I bring you," he said. "Because you are under my protection. Because among the Modoc, debts of life are sacred. You saved mine, now I save yours. This is understood. This is honored." "And after?" she asked. "What happens when we reach your people? Do I stay there forever? Do I raise my daughter in a world I don't understand?" "You stay as long as you need to," he replied. "Until you're safe. Until Grimes gives up or dies. Until your daughter is old enough that no one can take her from you through legal tricks or violence. Then you choose, stay or go, my people or yours. The choice will always be yours." It was more than she had hoped for, more than she had any right to expect. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked quietly. "The truth. Not just about repaying a debt." He set down his tea, his jaw working as he considered his answer. "Because 7 years ago when you pulled me from that creek, you didn't know who I was, what I was. You just saw someone who needed help," he said, his voice rough. "In a world where most see my skin and decide I'm less than human. You saw me as human first, and that matters. That changes things." He paused, the pain in his eyes deepening. "And because my daughter would be about your daughter's age now," he continued. "If she lived, if I could have saved her. If the world had been different, and maybe I can't find her. Maybe I can't bring her back, but I can make sure another child doesn't suffer what she suffered. I can stop one evil, even if I couldn't stop the other." Emmeline felt tears running down her face. "Tell me about her," she said softly. And there, beside a spring and country older than memory, Pakwa began to speak. He told her about a little girl with wild curls and fierce spirit, who had learned to walk by pulling herself up on her father's leg, who laughed at birds and cried at thunder, who was taken on a cold morning by soldiers who claimed legal authority over lives they had no right to touch. He told her about searching for 7 years, following rumors and lies, finding graves and empty promises, never stopping, never giving up, even when hope became just a word. He told her about the guilt that ate at him every day, the knowledge that he had been away when they came, that his daughter had called for him and he hadn't been there to answer. Emmeline listened, holding her own daughter close, understanding now the full weight of what Pakwa carried. When he finished, they sat in silence, the spring bubbling its ancient song, birds calling in the trees, the world continuing despite human pain. "We should move," he said finally, standing, extinguishing the fire with practiced efficiency. "We've rested enough, and Walsh will be riding hard." Emmeline rose, secured her daughter once more, shouldered her small pack. They continued north, climbing higher into country where the air grew thin and cold, where snow still clung to shadowed slopes despite the season, where civilization became a distant memory. Behind them, their pursuers struggled through difficult terrain. Ahead of them, somewhere in the vast wilderness, a Modoc camp waited, and between those 2 points, a widowed mother and a broken warrior walked together, both carrying losses too heavy to name, both protecting what remained. both learning that family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was choice. Sometimes it was the person who stood beside you when everyone else walked away. Sometimes it was forged in fire and sealed with trust. The sun climbed toward noon, burning bright and merciless. But they kept walking, step after step, into country that would either save them or swallow them whole. The mountains closed around them like ancient hands, peaks rising sharp and white against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air thin enough that every breath required conscious effort and left Emmeline dizzy if she moved too quickly. They had been traveling for 2 full days since crossing the canyon, following trails that weren't trails at all. Just corridors through dense forest and across bare stone where Pakwa read signs invisible to anyone else. A broken branch here, a stone displaced there. Markers left by his people to guide their own and confuse outsiders. Emmeline's feet were blistered inside her boots. Her shoulders ached from carrying the baby. And exhaustion had become a constant companion that whispered suggestions about stopping, resting, giving up, but she pushed through it, driven by the knowledge that somewhere behind them, Walsh and his men were still coming, delayed by the destroyed bridge but not stopped, motivated by Grimes's gold and the promise of violence. The baby had adapted remarkably well to their circumstances, sleeping when they walked, waking to feed, then sleeping again, as if she understood on some instinctive level that silence meant survival. Pakwa maintained his steady pace, never seeming to tire, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Reading the forest the way other men read newspapers, he stopped suddenly. Raising his hand in a gesture Emmeline had learned meant freeze. Don't move, don't breathe, she obeyed instantly, her heart immediately hammering. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening to something she couldn't hear. Then he relaxed, but only marginally, and gestured for her to come forward slowly. "What is it?" she whispered when she reached him. "We're being watched," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Have been for the last mile, my people, scouts. Making sure we're not leading enemies to the camp." "How do you know they're your people?" she asked, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. "Because if they were Walsh's men, we'd already be dead," he replied with the calm certainty of someone stating simple facts. He cupped his hands around his mouth and made a sound. A bird call so perfect that Emmeline would have sworn it came from an actual bird if she hadn't been standing right next to him. The call echoed through the forest. Then silence. A moment later, the same call came back, but from a slightly different pitch. Pakwa visibly relaxed, tension leaving his shoulders. "They know me," he said. "We're safe now, the camp is close." Just over the next ridge, they walked another half hour, climbing a steep slope where Emmeline had to use her hands as much as her feet, pulling herself up using roots and rocks. At the top, the forest opened into a high mountain valley that took her breath away. A stream ran through the center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, its water so clear she could see every stone on the bottom, even from this distance. Meadowgrass grew thick and green, dotted with wildflowers in colors she had no names for, and scattered across this valley, arranged in a careful pattern that spoke of generations of knowledge about wind and water and sun. Stood perhaps 30 dwellings. They weren't the teepees Emmeline had seen in drawings, but different, more permanent structures. Dome-shaped and covered with bark and hides, smoke rising from openings at their tops. People moved between them, women tending fires, children playing some game with sticks and a ball, men working on what looked like hunting equipment, dogs running and barking as they descended into the valley. Heads turned, conversation stopped, activities paused. By the time they reached the first dwelling, a crowd had gathered, perhaps 40 people, watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. Emmeline felt their eyes on her, weighing her, judging her, seeing her pale skin and worn dress, and immediately categorizing her as other. As outsider, as potential threat, she held her daughter closer, fighting the urge to turn and run. Pakwa walked forward confidently, and the crowd parted for him. Respect evident in how they made way, an older woman emerged from the largest dwelling. Her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. Her gray hair braided with strips of red cloth. Her clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to create. She looked at Pakwa, then at Emmeline, then back at Pakwa. They spoke in Modoc, the language flowing between them too fast for Emmeline to catch individual words, even if she had understood them. The woman's expression shifted from stern to surprise to something softer, and she looked at Emmeline with new eyes. Pakwa turned to Emmeline, switching to English. "This is Anina, elder of this band, keeper of our histories and laws," he said. "I have told her your story, how you saved my life 7 years ago. How I have now saved yours and your child's. She understands the debt and honors it." Anina stepped forward, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose joints ached but whose spirit refused to acknowledge weakness. She looked at the baby, then reached out with gnarled fingers to gently touch the child's cheek. The baby, instead of crying or pulling away, smiled. Anina smiled back, the expression transforming her entire face. And she spoke in halting English. "Child knows no hate," she said. Her accent thick, but her words clear. "Child sees only kindness or fear. Your child sees no fear in old woman. This is good sign." She turned to the gathered crowd and spoke in Modoc, her voice carrying authority. The hostility Emmeline had felt earlier didn't disappear, but it diminished, replaced by something closer to cautious acceptance. "You stay," Anina said to Emmeline. "You are guest, you are protected. Anyone who harms you harms Pakwa." "Anyone who harms Pakwa answers to me." It wasn't exactly warm, but it was more than Emmeline had hoped for. A younger woman stepped forward, perhaps Emmeline's age. With kind eyes and a baby of her own strapped to her back, she gestured for Emmeline to follow, speaking in Modoc but with hand signals that made her meaning clear. She led Emmeline to a dwelling near the stream, smaller than most but well-maintained, and showed her inside. The interior was dim but surprisingly spacious, the walls lined with furs and woven mats. A fire pit in the center with stones arranged for cooking. Baskets of dried food hanging from the supports. It smelled of smoke and earth, and something herbal she couldn't identify. The woman made more gestures, showing Emmeline where to sleep, where to find water, offering food from a basket. Emmeline tried to communicate her gratitude, her hands moving in what she hoped were universal gestures of thanks. The woman smiled and said something in Modoc, then left, but not before placing her hand briefly on Emmeline's shoulder in a gesture that transcended language. Emmeline sank onto the sleeping furs, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion that crashed over her like a wave. She fed her daughter, then lay down with the baby beside her. And sleep took her before she could even worry about what came next. She woke to voices outside, urgent and sharp. The light coming through the dwelling's entrance suggested late afternoon, meaning she'd slept for hours. Her daughter was gone. Panic seized her instantly, and she scrambled up, rushing outside. The camp was in motion, men gathering weapons, women hurrying children toward the far end of the valley, dogs barking with the excitement that came before hunting or fighting. She found Pakwa near the center of the activity, speaking rapidly with several men, all of them armed. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded. Her voice rising above the commotion, he turned to her, his face grim. "She's safe. Anina has her. They're moving the children and elders to the caves above the valley," he said. "Walsh found us." "How?" Emmeline asked. Feeling her world tilt, "He captured one of our scouts. Tortured him until he talked, then killed him anyway," Pakwa replied, his voice tight with controlled rage. "They're coming up the main trail now, maybe an hour away, 6 men. All armed. What do we do?" she asked. "We fight," he said simply. "This is our land, our home. We don't run from men like Walsh." One of the other men spoke sharply in Modoc, gesturing at Emmeline with clear hostility. Pakwa responded firmly, his voice brooking no argument. The man spat on the ground and walked away. "What did he say?" Emmeline asked. Though she could guess that you brought this trouble. That we should give you to Walsh and be done with it, Pakwa said honestly. "I told him that would happen when the sun rose in the west and the dead walked. Maybe he's right," she said quietly. "Maybe I should go to them, end this before anyone else gets hurt." Pakwa grabbed her shoulders. His grip firm but not painful, his eyes boring into hers. "Listen to me," he said intensely. "Walsh doesn't want justice. He wants blood. He wants to make an example. If you go to him, he'll kill you slowly. He'll take your daughter anyway. And he'll still attack this camp because we helped you. Your surrender changes nothing except you die badly." "Then what?" she asked, fear making her voice shake. "Then you trust me one more time," he said. "I have a plan, but I need you to be brave. Braver than you've ever been." Before she could respond, a young boy ran into camp, breathing hard. Speaking rapidly in Modoc, Pakwa's expression darkened. "They're closer than we thought," he said. 30 minutes, maybe less," he turned to Emmeline. "Go to the caves, stay with your daughter. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay there until someone comes for you. Understand? I can't just hide while you fight," she protested. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "Your job is to survive, to keep your daughter safe. That's not hiding, that's winning. Because if you live, if she lives, then Walsh loses no matter what happens here." A woman appeared beside them. The same one who had shown Emmeline the dwelling earlier. She took Emmeline's hand and pulled gently but insistently. Emmeline looked back at Pakwa one last time. "Don't die," she said, the words inadequate but all she had. "Not planning on it," he replied, something that might have been a smile flickering across his face. Then she was being led away, half running up a steep trail that wound through rocks. Other women and children ahead and behind her. Everyone moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of drills run many times. The caves were actually a series of natural chambers carved into the mountainside. Hidden behind rocks and brush, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, Anina waited with the children, including Emmeline's daughter, who was being held by a girl, perhaps 10 years old. Emmeline took her baby back, checking her frantically, but she was fine. Clean and fed and content, they settled into the deepest chamber. Women positioning themselves between the children and the entrance, armed with knives and clubs, prepared to defend if defense became necessary. Then they waited. The silence was worse than any sound could have been. Minutes stretched like hours. Then they heard it, gunshots echoing up from the valley. Sharp cracks that made several children cry. More shots, a whole volley, then shouting. Impossible to make out words, but the anger and violence clear in the tones. A woman near Emmeline gripped her hand, squeezing hard. And Emmeline realized with surprise that the gesture was meant to comfort her. Not seek comfort. The sounds of battle continued, seeming to go on forever, then gradually silence. Emmeline's heart hammered so hard, she thought it might break her ribs. Who had won? Was Pakwa alive? Should she go look? Anina made a sharp gesture, clearly communicating that everyone should stay exactly where they were. More time passed, impossible to judge how much. Then footsteps on the trail outside, someone climbing toward the caves. Every woman raised her weapon. Emmeline held her daughter close, preparing to fight if necessary, to die protecting her if that's what it came to. A shadow appeared at the cave entrance. Then Pakwa stepped into view, alive but bloodied. A cut above his eye still dripping, his shirt torn and stained. Relief flooded through Emmeline so powerfully she almost collapsed. He spoke in Modoc to Anina. His voice weary, she nodded, responding briefly. Then gestured for everyone to follow him back down. They descended the trail slowly, children clinging to mothers. Everyone uncertain what they would find. The camp was damaged but standing, one dwelling burned to the ground. Others showing bullet holes and scattered belongings. 4 Modoc men stood near the center, wounded but alive, being tended by other women. And on the ground, lined up like cordwood, were 6 bodies, Walsh and his entire crew. Dead, Emmeline stared, unable to process it. Pakwa appeared beside her. They came in aggressive. Thought they could intimidate us with superior weapons, he said quietly. They didn't understand that we know this land, that we've fought here for generations. That guns mean nothing against people who know every rock and tree. Did anyone, she started to ask, then stopped, afraid of the answer. 2 wounded, neither seriously, he said. We were fortunate. Walsh was careless, angry. He made mistakes. He looked at the bodies. His expression unreadable. Grimes will send more, he said. When these don't return, he'll send more men, better men. And they'll keep coming until either he's dead or we are. Then what do we do? Emmeline asked, though she was starting to understand. Pakwa turned to face her fully. We end it, he said. Not by hiding, not by running, but by cutting off the head of the snake. You mean go back, she said. Go back to Prospect Ridge. I mean go back and finish this, he replied. Grimes thinks he's untouchable, that his wealth and position protect him. But he's wrong. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Everyone can be reached. That's suicide, she said. Maybe, he agreed, or maybe it's the only way to actually win. To make sure your daughter grows up free, instead of spending her whole life looking over her shoulder. He paused. Then added, I'm going with or without your permission, he said. But I'd rather go knowing you understand why. Emmeline looked around the camp. At the people who had taken her in despite having every reason not to. At the burned dwelling and wounded men. At the price they had paid for protecting her. She looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully despite the violence that had surrounded them. She thought about living the rest of her life in fear, about raising her child in hiding, about Grimes sending men again and again until eventually he succeeded. When do we leave? She asked. Pakwa's eyebrows rose in surprise. We, he repeated. You think I'm letting you go alone? She said. After everything. You think I'm going to hide in a cave while you risk your life for me again? No, if we're ending this, we end it together. You have a child to protect, he said. Exactly, she replied. And the best way to protect her is to make sure Grimes can never threaten her again. I may not be a warrior, but I'm not useless. I can help. He studied her face for a long moment. You've changed, he said finally. When I first saw you in that square, you looked like someone who had given up. Now you look like someone who fights. You taught me that, she said. You and your people. You taught me that running isn't the same as surviving. He nodded slowly. Then we leave at dawn, he said, both of us. Together. My daughter, she started, will stay here with Anina. Safer than anywhere else in the world, he said. And if we don't return, should be raised as one of the people, taught our ways. Given a good life, it was the hardest decision Emmeline had ever faced. But she knew it was the right one. She spent the rest of the evening with her daughter, holding her, memorizing every detail of her face, singing songs her own mother had sung, making promises she desperately hoped she could keep. When night fell and the baby finally slept, Emmeline laid her carefully in Anina's arms. The old woman looked at her with respect that hadn't been there before. You warrior now, Anina said in her careful English. You fight for child. This is strongest magic. Emmeline couldn't speak. Could only nod. She walked to the dwelling Pakwa was using. Found him checking weapons and supplies. Ready? He asked. No, she said honestly. But let's go anyway. They left before dawn, slipping out of the valley while everyone else slept. Heading back toward civilization, back toward Prospect Ridge. Back toward the monster who had started all of this, back to end it, one way or another. The journey back to Prospect Ridge took 4 days instead of 3, because they traveled carefully, avoiding main trails and settlements where Grimes might have informants watching for them. Moving like ghosts through country that grew progressively more civilized and therefore more dangerous with each passing mile. They no longer moved as protector and protected, but as partners, each contributing their strengths. Pakwa's knowledge of terrain and tracking combined with Emmeline's understanding of how white settlements operated, where guards would be posted when patrols would change. Details she had absorbed without realizing simply from living in that world. The landscape transformed around them as they descended from the high country. The clean air and open spaces giving way to dust and cultivation. The silence replaced by the sounds of mining operations and cattle and human commerce. The smell of industry and waste replacing pine and stone. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking Prospect Ridge on the 4th evening, Emmeline felt like she was returning to a foreign country. Somewhere that had once been familiar but now felt alien and hostile. Its values and violence suddenly visible to her in ways they hadn't been when she lived here. They made camp in a stand of rocks above the town, close enough to observe but far enough to remain hidden, and watched as lanterns began lighting windows and the sounds of the evening rush at the saloons drifted up to them on the wind. Grimes will be at the Red Canyon, Pakwa said, studying the town through the gathering darkness. He's there every night, holds court like a king, makes deals, collects debts, reminds everyone who owns what. The building has guards, Emmeline said, remembering the men who always stood outside, armed and watchful, front and back entrances. Probably more inside. How many total? He asked. 6 that I saw regularly, she replied. Maybe more depending on the night and how much trouble he's expecting. Pakwa was quiet for a moment, thinking, we can't fight our way through 6 armed men, he said finally. Even if we could, the noise would bring the whole town. We need to be smarter. What if we don't go to him? Emmeline said slowly. An idea forming. What if we make him come to us? He looked at her with interest. Explain, he said. Grimes is paranoid about his mines, she said, remembering conversations she'd overheard in the market. The Silverton mine especially, it's his most productive. The one that made his fortune, if something threatened it. If there was a fire or a collapse or sabotage, he'd go there personally to assess the damage and protect his investment. And mines are isolated, Pakwa said, following her logic, away from town, away from help. Easier to control the situation. Exactly, she said. We create a crisis at the mine, he comes running. And we're waiting for him. It's risky, he said. If we're wrong about his response, if he sends men instead of going himself, we've shown our hand for nothing. Do you have a better idea? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. No, he admitted finally, and it might work. Grimes is the kind of man who trusts no one else with what's truly important to him. He'd want to see the damage himself. Make sure his managers weren't lying or stealing. They spent the next 2 hours planning, going over every detail, every possibility, everything that could go wrong. The Silverton mine sat 3 miles north of town, carved into the side of a mountain where a silver vein ran deep and true. The main shaft descending hundreds of feet with multiple tunnels branching off, all of it held up by timber supports that required constant maintenance. The mine operated day and night, but the night shift was smaller, maybe 20 men underground, with only 2 guards watching the entrance and the equipment. We start a fire in one of the storage buildings, Emmeline said. The one where they keep the blasting powder, it'll burn hot and fast. Create enough smoke that they'll see it from town, but we make sure the miners get out first. I won't have their deaths on my conscience. Agreed, Pakwa said. We're not murderers, we clear the mine. Then set the fire. Grimes will come, she continued. Probably with his personal guards, maybe 4 men total. He'll be focused on the fire, on saving what he can. Assessing the damage. And that's when we take him, Pakwa finished. Away from the fire, away from witnesses. Somewhere we can talk without interruption. Talk, Emmeline repeated. Surprised. I'm not an assassin, he said firmly. I'm not putting a knife in a man's back in the dark. If Grimes dies, he dies facing me, knowing why. Understanding what he's done. And if he doesn't agree to leave us alone, she asked. If he refuses to back down, then we do what's necessary, he said. His voice hard, but we give him the choice first. That's what separates us from him. They waited until full dark. Then moved down toward the mine, circling wide to avoid the road where anyone might see them. The mine entrance glowed with lamplight, voices carrying on the night air. The sound of metal on stone echoing from underground where men worked in heat and darkness for wages that barely kept their families fed. Pakwa approached the first guard from behind, moving with the silence that seemed to be as natural to him as breathing, and struck him once at the base of the skull with the pommel of his knife. The man dropped without a sound. The second guard turned at the noise, his hand moving toward his rifle. But Emmeline stepped out of the shadows. Please, she said, her voice desperate. Playing the part. Please help my husband, he's hurt. He fell. The guard hesitated, confused, trying to process why a woman would be out here alone at night. That moment of hesitation was all Pakwa needed. He emerged from the darkness and struck the second guard the same way. Catching him as he fell, they dragged both men away from the entrance, far enough that they wouldn't be in danger from the fire, and tied them securely. I'm sorry, Emmeline whispered to the unconscious men. But you'll understand when you wake up. Then they entered the mine. The heat hit them immediately. Rising from below where dozens of lanterns burned and men swung picks in cramped tunnels. Pakwa cupped his hands and shouted down the shaft in English, then in Modoc, then in Spanish. Fire, everyone out. Fire at the entrance. Evacuate now. His voice echoed and re-echoed, amplified by the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard shouts, questions, and finally the sound of men running. Miners began emerging from the shaft, covered in dust and sweat, some looking scared, others angry at what they assumed was a false alarm. Go to town, Emmeline told them, raising her voice. Tell everyone the mine is on fire. Get help. Hurry. The mention of fire galvanized them. They ran, most of them heading for Prospect Ridge to raise the alarm. Once the last miner emerged and Pakwa was satisfied the shaft was empty, they moved to the storage building. It was a simple wooden structure, poorly ventilated, filled with crates of blasting powder, coils of fuse, and barrels of oil used to keep the machinery running. Pakwa worked quickly, opening barrels, spreading oil across the wooden floor, positioning crates to ensure maximum damage. This is going to burn hot and fast, he said, once I light it. We have maybe 2 minutes before it becomes an inferno. Where do we position ourselves? Emmeline asked. The foreman's office, he said, pointing to a small building on the opposite side of the mine entrance. It has a view of the whole area. We can see Grimes arrive. Can control when and where we confront him. He struck flint against steel, sparks falling into the oil-soaked wood. Flame caught immediately, spreading faster than seemed possible. They ran for the office as fire roared behind them, consuming the storage building with hungry efficiency. Inside the foreman's office, they positioned themselves by the window. Watching, the fire grew, flames reaching 30 feet high, smoke billowing into the night sky like a signal visible for miles. 10 minutes passed, then they heard horses, coming fast from the direction of town, 4 riders. One of them clearly Grimes even at this distance, his fine coat and commanding posture unmistakable. They rode straight to the mine entrance, dismounting while still moving. Grimes shouting orders to his men. The powder. Did the powder go up? He yelled. I don't know, boss, one of his guards replied. Looks like it's still burning. Get water. Get buckets. Get every man we can find, Grimes snarled. I'm not losing this mind to incompetence. He strode toward the storage building, his back to the foreman's office. Focused entirely on the fire, Pakwa nodded to Emmeline. They emerged from the office, moving quietly, positioning themselves between Grimes and his guards. Luther Grimes, Pakwa called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. Grimes spun around, his face registering first confusion, then recognition, then fury. You, he spat, his hand moving toward his gun. Don't, Pakwa said. And there was something in his voice that made Grimes freeze. The three guards had their rifles up now, pointed at Pakwa and Emmeline. You're outnumbered, Grimes said, his confidence returning, and outgunned. Whatever you think you're doing here, it ends now. You die here, and the widow dies. And I still get the child. The child is beyond your reach, Emmeline said, her voice steady despite her fear. She's somewhere you'll never find her, protected by people who don't fear you or your money. Nothing is beyond my reach, Grimes said. I own this territory. I own the law. I own enough men that I could burn every Modoc camp from here to California if I wanted to. Then why haven't you? Pakwa asked quietly. The question seemed to confuse Grimes. What? He said. Why haven't you already done that? Pakwa continued. If you're so powerful, if you truly own everything, why negotiate? Why make threats? Why not simply act? I don't have to explain myself to a savage, Grimes snarled. You don't, Pakwa agreed, but I know the answer anyway. You haven't acted because you're not as powerful as you pretend, because even men like you have limits. Because deep down you know that if you push too hard, if you cross certain lines, the people you've been oppressing will rise up and destroy everything you've built. Ridiculous, Grimes said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Emmeline asked. How many men have you cheated? How many families have you destroyed? How many people hate you so much they'd celebrate if you died? You think your guards can protect you from all of them? I think my guards can kill both of you right now, Grimes replied. Regaining his composure, they probably can, Pakwa said. But before they do, before you give that order, you should know something. He reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and pulled out a leather document folder. What is that? Grimes asked warily. Insurance, Pakwa replied. Information about your business dealings, forged contracts, bribed officials, murdered competitors, all documented, all witnessed, all ready to be delivered to the territorial governor if anything happens to us. It was a bluff. They had no such documents, but Grimes didn't know that. His face went pale. You're lying, he said. But uncertainty crept into his voice. Maybe, Pakwa said. Or maybe I spent the last 4 days not just planning how to kill you, but preparing to destroy everything you've built, even if you kill me. Either way, do you want to risk it? Grimes was silent, his mind clearly racing through calculations. What do you want? He finally asked. We want you to leave us alone, Emmeline said. Forever, no more hunting. No more hired guns, no more legal maneuvers. You forget we exist, and we forget you exist. And if I refuse, he asked, then these documents go to the governor tonight, Pakwa said. And by tomorrow you'll be arrested for fraud, bribery, and murder. Your empire will collapse. Your mines will be seized. Everything you've worked for will be gone. You can't prove any of that, Grimes said. I don't have to prove all of it, Pakwa replied. Just enough to start an investigation. And once people start looking closely at your business, once they start asking questions, how long before everything unravels? Grimes stood frozen, trapped between rage and pragmatism. Fine, he finally said, the word forced out through clenched teeth. Take your bastard child and disappear. But if I ever see either of you again, if you ever come back to this territory, The deal is off. Agreed, Pakwa said. One more thing, Grimes added, his eyes cold. You're going to put out that fire. You're going to help save my mine. Or the deal is off right now. Pakwa looked at the burning storage building. Then at Emmeline, she nodded. All right, he said. We'll help. For the next 2 hours, they worked alongside Grimes's men, forming bucket lines from the creek, dousing flames, preventing the fire from spreading to the main shaft. It was surreal. Fighting side by side with men who had been trying to kill them days earlier. But it worked. They saved the mine, though the storage building was a total loss. When the fire was finally out and only smoke remained, Grimes approached them one last time. We're done here, he said. Leave now. And don't come back. They didn't argue. They mounted the horse they'd hidden nearby and rode into the dawn. Behind them, Prospect Ridge grew smaller, becoming just another town in a territory full of them. They rode north for 3 days, retracing their route through the mountains. When they finally descended into the valley where the Modoc camp waited, Emmeline's heart soared. Her daughter was there, healthy and happy, being bounced on Anina's knee while other children played nearby. Emmeline dismounted before the horse fully stopped, running to her child, scooping her up. Holding her so tight the baby protested with a squeal. Thank you, she said to Anina, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for keeping her safe, the old woman smiled. She good baby, Anina said, strong spirit. Like mother, Pakwa stood back, watching the reunion with an expression Emmeline couldn't quite read. Later that evening, after the celebration feast, the camp held to welcome them back. After her daughter had finally fallen asleep, Emmeline found Pakwa sitting by the stream, staring at the water. She sat beside him without asking permission. What happens now? She asked quietly. You stay here as long as you need, he said. Raise your daughter, learn our ways if you want or don't. It's your choice. And you? She asked. He was quiet for a long time. I'm going to keep looking, he said finally. For my daughter, I've rested long enough. It's time to search again. You've been searching for 7 years, she said gently. Maybe it's time to accept that she's gone. Maybe, he agreed. But not yet, not while there's still a chance. No matter how small, she understood. Some wounds never healed, some losses never stopped hurting. If you ever need anything, she said, if your search brings you back this way, you'll always have family here. He looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. Family, he repeated. You saved my daughter, she said. You saved me, you taught me how to be strong. That makes you family in every way that matters. He nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged overhead. 2 people who had saved each other in different ways. 2 people who understood that family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was choice. Sometimes it was the person who stood beside you when the world tried to tear you apart. Sometimes it was forged in fire and sealed with trust. Pakwa left 3 days later, heading east toward rumors of a child matching his daughter's description, seen in a settlement near the Colorado border. Emmeline watched him go, knowing he might never return, knowing his search might never end, but she also knew he needed to try. That some debts could only be paid through persistence. That some loves never let go. She turned back to the camp, to her daughter playing with other children, to Anina teaching her the words for different plants, to a life she was building in a place she never expected to call home. The baby laughed, the sound pure and bright. And Emmeline realized something she hadn't felt in years. She was happy, not the absence of pain, but happiness despite it. Not forgetting the past, but building despite it. Not running from fear, but living despite it. She had lost a husband, lost her home, nearly lost everything, but she had gained something too. Strength she didn't know she possessed. Family she never expected. a future she could shape with her own hands. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, turning them gold and purple, Anina called everyone together. She spoke in Modoc, her words flowing like water. And though Emmeline understood only fragments, she felt the meaning. Something about belonging, about courage, about a woman who had proven herself. The old woman approached Emmeline and placed a necklace around her neck, similar to Paqua's, but with different symbols carved into the bones. "You are Modoc now," Anina said in careful English. "You are one of the people. Your daughter is one of the people. This is your home if you want it." Emmeline touched the necklace, feeling the weight of bones that told stories, that carried history. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I would be honored." The camp erupted in celebration, drums appearing from nowhere, voices rising in songs that made Emmeline's skin prickle with their beauty and power. Her daughter clapped her tiny hands, delighted by the noise and movement, and somewhere far to the east, Pakwa rode alone under the same stars, still searching, still hoping, carrying his own losses but no longer carrying them alone, because he knew now that he had family waiting, that he belonged somewhere, that his story wasn't over. In Prospect Ridge, Luther Grimes sat in his office at the Red Canyon Saloon, staring at ledgers that detailed his empire, but for the first time in his life feeling less like a king and more like a man who had built his kingdom on sand. The widow and the savage had won, not through superior force, but through something he had never possessed: the willingness to sacrifice everything for something other than themselves. He poured another drink and tried to forget, but some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be unheard. And in the high country, where the air was thin and clean, where ancient mountains kept watch over valleys, where people still lived according to older laws, a woman and her daughter slept peacefully, protected by family, bound by choice, free at last.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.